interested in where the film fits into the landscape of documentary or films about films, which are kind of now gone. Now that now that everything's VOD, it's like the concept of special features or something that's about a film is kind of receding into the landscape.
Which is a drag for, I have at least one friend who's, most of his work is making DVD extras. So that's maybe not the most secure place to be right now.
That's very true. I hadn't thought of it as putting it in a bigger sense like you did there. That's cool.
Would you call it, I don't know, we have something in our video magazine that we call video essays, which are basically an essay you would have about a film, like if you were an academic, but instead of writing about a scene, you're able to show that scene.
Sure.
Is that what you would describe it as?
Certainly there's a big video essay influence, and in the making of it, I had seen and considered things like the 90-minute Star Wars reviews, or that deconstruction of the that car chase scene in The Dark Knight, or those amazing ones that Kirby Ferguson does. Everything's a remix.
Yeah.
Probably what makes 237 different from a lot of those is it's not my voiceover driving it. It's a roundup of 5 other experts' points of view that we're struggling to sort of illuminate.
And you're using the voiceover, and I mean, I can understand that you don't want to have to create a bias by showing maybe the person that's delivering it. You want to kind of purely represent what they think about the film, but the voiceover is still also kind of a loaded technique in documentary. Otherwise, it's almost has that aura of being a Richard Attenborough kind of factual.
That voiceover brings a certain credence and authority. That's true.
Yeah, well, and I'm always interested in the way that, in documentaries, sometimes a person is brought forth as the expert, and there's never a contrary opinion. And depending on how much time they spend, building up this person's credentials, the audience is more or less inclined to take what he says as gospel. So I think going into it, we weren't exactly sure, what the ramifications were going to be of using these competing voices, but presenting alternate points of view in that format seemed like an interesting experiment to go through and to find out for ourselves as it played whether different voices would reinforce each other or all be mutually exclusive.
One thing we talked about early on was nature documentaries, where you see the poor hungry gazelle the poor hungry lion and needs to feed its cubs, and it tracks down the gazelle. And then you see the other version, which is about the lovely gazelle that's trying to survive, and this horrible lion is haunting it. And you could use the same footage, it would just be a different voiceover or a different point of view. That was one of the things we talked about.
I teach a film editing class, and one of the first exercises we run through is a bunch of nature footage. And having previously spent a fair amount of time discussing screen direction, I would have the students make these little dramas where like a mouse comes out of a hole and he looks screen right, and we have a shot of a hawk looking screen left, and then the mouse continues, turns around and goes back into the hole. Or actually that mouse shot is one continuous shot. It comes out of the hole, looks screen right, runs back into the hole. But if you intercut it with the shot of the hawk, clearly it seems like the hawk is looking at the mouse and the mouse is reacting to the hawk. And it's always kind of mind-blowing because people assume that you're watching a documentary and everything you see is exactly the way it happened, and very clearly these are two very real things. The mouse did come out of the hole and go back in, and the hawk did turn this way, but the only reason that we're making this relationship is based on screen direction and these opposing looks, which is something that most people don't even question. But I think that was an exercise among many that we did in the class that made me kind of question some of the conventions of the documentary form, and made me think it would be fun to kind of manipulate some of those. Also there's that long section in the film where John Thel Ryan is talking about his experiences working in a film archive, and how he started to doubt the relationship between what he was seeing and what he was saying, and what he was seeing in the footage and what he was hearing in the voiceover. He suggested that Kubrick, having seen those sorts of newsreels growing up, might have been doing something very similar in The Shining. And of course, that gave me permission in the edit to stretch the relationship between what we're seeing and what we're hearing, in kind of interesting ways.
Well, I find it interesting that you use repetitive shots, especially of the theater, some people watching in the beginning, because it cues the spectator to be aware that you are imposing these images over these voiceovers, like you're selecting it. And because even if you were taking freely from different sources, then that may make someone think of a kind of curator of images. The fact that when you repeat an image, it seems like you shouldn't do that, like that it doesn't work.
But when you repeat an image, now you're seeing it in a new context, but you can still keep the old context in mind. Like we always get an interesting reaction. There's that time where Jay Widener is talking about some of the images that he sees when he moves through the film very slowly. In particular, that little hidden image when Jack and Ullman shake hands, and 10 minutes or so later, we see that shot again when Julie is talking about the window. And people remember that first thing, but now they're seeing this shot in a different way. And of course, the other exercise that I got especially engaged in was using the same characters as surrogates for different people. So Jack Nicholson can sometimes be Jack Nicholson, but he can also be Jack Torrance, or he can also be Stanley Kubrick, or he can also be Bill Blakemore, or he can also be how many other people, and kind of testing that, I think was one of the fun games, in the process.
What about the process of altering the images, kind of intervening and adding like video where there isn't any, or changing the Shining poster, inserting?
Yeah, well, I tried to. It was great fun to do that, especially at that beginning when we see the Shining posters. Although there's a part of me that was kind of reluctant to do it, because I was getting more, as the process continued, I was getting more and more interested in how different can the image be, and can we expect the audience to project something different on it? Like, could he be really looking at just a poster for a jazz musician, and can the audience see that as a poster for The Shining? Though we started a little easier, and also in a way that trying to make it seamless enough that a lot of people have said, was he really looking at a poster for The Shining? I don't remember that scene. I don't know if I answered that question, but
well, there's an implication as well, because it's a film about looking closely at like the text, and the text as being the sacred object, and you are clearly taking away that pristine wrapping. And
well, I mean, that goes into John Phil Ryan's thing of what you're hearing and what you're seeing is sometimes the same thing, but other times you need to pay attention and challenge it and consider it. I don't know that Room 237 has an obligation to be more rigorous in that relationship than the film that we're talking about.
I mean, the film starts with kind of an interesting joke like that, which is we see Tom Cruise walking down the street in Eyes Wide Shut, and the village in New York is standing in for Europe, and he's standing in for Bill Blakemore, who's going to tell us the story about seeing the film for the first time. And we have a burn that says Europe. Well, in fact, it is Europe, because Stanley Kubrick shot that, as we know, near his home in England. So I think that kind of, on a repeat viewing, or at least for me, I always kind of feel like we're pretty straightforward and lay our cards on the table right off the bat about what we're going to do with repurposing footage and so forth, assigning meaning or allowing meaning to be assigned to different shots.
And the use of different films that are outside of the Shining clips, even outside of Kubrick, they kind of make the viewer aware that the entire thing is about media consumption to a certain extent, because the associations that the experts are making are the associations that they've come to through their own life and what they've read or been interested in outside of the film, and that brings us to your interests in what are the clips that you have chosen.
Well, sure, and a lot of those clips are things that have been personally very important to me, and are sort of images that come to my mind when I'm hearing these folks talk, but also imagining, the kind of landscape of film that they're moving through, and the ones that have made big influences on them, or characters from these movies that they might see themselves in.
Yeah, I think there's a moment that really resonates for me in that, where Bill Blakemore is talking about discovering that the film is really about the Native American Indians, and there's this shot of very emblematic shot from a Western of the scout looking down and seeing this Indian tribe coming and so forth, and I feel like that's the image that would have been going through both the narrator and the viewer automatically anyway, if we hadn't put it there. At least the one that pops into my mind.
One that stood out to me was a shot from what looked to be the TV series version of The Shining, but it was kind of apropos of nothing. It was kind of just snuck in there. It didn't seem like there was a one-to-one relationship with what was being talked about.
Well, no, I wouldn't want to tell you how you have to see it, although maybe I'm in danger of doing that in this interview throughout. But the Shining TV series is the handful of clips that we use from there are to represent the Shining book, because Stephen King was much more actively involved in the miniseries, and although it's not it takes its own departures from the book as much as the Kubrick film does, it does restore a lot of elements from the book that people questioned, the hedge animals and the garden hose attack, and a few other things. So that was sort of, thinking about the other places it uses, there may be 2 or 3 different things that are happening with the TV series, but one of its purposes was to represent scenes from the book.
And it's interesting, I can't remember which expert mentions it, but they're talking about what they call kind of postmodern approach to intent, and it's kind of basically Roland Barthes' Death of the Author. And it's interesting the way Kubrick's relationship to King, and not really caring about what was going on in the book, he was basically just going to appropriate it. It's almost the same relationship that they are having to the Kubrick film, which is that to a certain point his intent doesn't necessarily matter. It's what their reading of the text is.
Well, or his intent doesn't matter to one degree, but it's also kind of impossible to know. Yeah. Because he would both, be reluctant to talk about his intent. I think there was a quote from him where, he said, saying something plainly, this is not the words that he used, but he said saying something plainly is much less potent than leaving it in a subtler way for people to come and discover on their own. And that if the Mona Lisa had a little plaque underneath it saying, she's smiling this way because she's thinking about a lost lover, then people would immediately lose all interest in it. So you put that into context with the idea that choices could have been made subconsciously or, through some other random kind of act, or through the influence of a production designer or a cameraman or an actor, that, these kind of allegories and symbols could have gotten into the film in any number of ways.
And I have to admit that I'm more on board with that kind of postmodern approach, because what struck me as odd is how almost slavishly many of the experts are in establishing the intent and trying to argue why this would be plausible when it seems like, that's unknowable. So when they're talking about, one was mentioning that Kubrick was probably getting bored at this point. That's, to me, of all of the intent arguments, is the most personal. How would you know how bored he was? At least when you're talking about he may have read this book. Yeah. That's
Well, I think that goes to something that I've always experienced watching his films, is that his point of view is so clear and resonates so strongly with so many of us that, I watch a Stanley Kubrick movie, and, ever since I was a teenager and when I was, a ridiculous suburban punk, and, Clockwork Orange was the most important film to me. I had to assume that the person who made it was somebody very much like myself, because we had the same sense of humor and we had the same sensibility and the same values. So I think it therefore becomes easier to imagine what's going through the head of the filmmaker. think that's what I got.
Okay.
Well, there's also, I mean, some people put forward as if Kubrick's intention was to create a riddle, and to create a riddle that perhaps only they could decipher. So that, again, like Rodney's saying, that personalizes the relationship between not only them in the film, but them and the filmmaker, you know?
Yeah, well, and I might think that another thing that kind of sort of happened accidentally in the making of this film that seemed to be kind of an interesting little thread that was running through it is, besides looking at the different theories people have about what the film really means, a lot of them have sort of different strategies for decoding the movie. And those are strategies that are used by different people to interpret, you know, different works of art or the world around them, and sort of exploring those different angles of attack. I thought it was something that I just found was really interesting. Like, I know, like, Bill Blakemore and Julie Kearns. Well, and actually in Jeff, I'm going to say, like, at the beginning, they each found sort of like a key, whether it was the Calumet can or the skier poster or the typewriter, that there was one little image that popped up, and then that helped stimulate the rest of them. And then some of the other folks, I guess there's only two other folks, but John Fell Ryan and Julie kind of had different strategies. No, John and Jay had two different, had other strategies to get underneath, to get into the hood of what's in the movie.
Yeah, and Bill Blakemore explicitly, and Jeffrey Cox not quite so, feels like the experience of the film, the intention of the experience of the film, is that you don't get it the first time. That was Stanley's intention, would be you would just experience it as a haunted house movie, and maybe you would think there's something wrong, I need to see it again, and then upon seeing it again, it would start to reveal itself. And for Blakemore, that's because the first time you see it, and this is in the film, you just remember how horrified you are for this woman and this child. And the second time, as you start to understand the deeper themes, you're able to transfer that immediate fear and concern for that family to the world at large and the family of man. So I just love that the setup is you're really supposed to have a sort of an unsatisfied experience the first time you view the film.
Well, and certainly the movie was made in 1980 at the very dawn of the home video revolution, and I don't think there was another film that was shot in the same way to allow itself for a 4:3 VHS conversion. Most movies have the left and right of the frame cropped off, which means you either lose some of the image or that the original widescreen composition was made much less compelling, so that the left and right edges of the frame were just filled with empty space that was expendable. But he shot it, where the top with full frames, so that you could extend the picture up and down to fill the 4:3 image. Which is why we can see the helicopter shadow in that one traveling shot. But, that so clearly speaks to the idea that this movie was very much designed to be rewatched on VHS, and to be formatted for that screen as well as the big screen.
Yeah, you can make a full movie about people arguing how what aspect ratio Kubrick wanted his films to be precise.
Totally.
But it's interesting you mentioned that, because I think one of all of the kind of approaches to the text, one that stood out to me is the forward-backwards one, because that's the one that's, I think, least likely to be argued that was necessarily Kubrick's intent. It seems like it's more just a pure enlightenment, an experience for the viewer to have, to kind of see it in a new way, but also how difficult that would be to attain prior to, just throwing in Final Cut and adjusting the opacity. And it seems like it's the one that's the most purely about just the spectator, and it has nothing to do with Kubrick was necessarily intending.
I mostly agree, though I think there is something to say that the structure of the film is symmetrical.
Yeah.
And certainly, like the first, a first very major section of the movie is a tour of the locations in which things are going to happen, and then and then we sort of revisit those scenes in roughly the same place towards the end of the film, or even you put that in context with the idea that I find very compelling, and I've seen in places, and I've seen in at least another place or two, that 2001 is some sort of reversal. The Shining is some sort of reversal of 2001. It's man's de-evolution to savagery instead of evolution to enlightenment and outer space. So even if the shot-by-shot juxtapositions might not always line up in compelling ways, though eerily enough they often do, being able to sort of see how the movie tracks backwards while you're watching it is a pretty interesting way to look at it. And I think that might work even if you had it in sort of an inset window.
Okay, yeah.
And you can say, wow, here's how the movie plays backwards.
I think for me, I think it's sort of the cinematic version of Burroughs' cut-ups.
Oh, yeah.
But I think it attests to Kubrick's symmetry that, I know it's not random, but that you could almost superimpose any images and there will be some interrelation because of the consistency of his framing and his vision.
Yeah, well, and I think it talks, a little bit about that John Phil Ryan near the end of the film says, this movie is kind of a trap for people like me because I go out and look for clues and I keep finding them. And like he sort of had this idea, he read, the mastermind had written, a lot about The Shining and had, this one sort of line, The Shining is a film made to be seen forwards and backwards. And he said, well, let me test that idea. And he was probably just as prepared for it not to amount to anything as for it to amount to something very, very serious. But then once he did it, he said, my God, look how much. He was surprised himself to see how much stuff lined up and how provocative it is. And since he's also the guy who talks about the importance of dissolves and how, it's not just a transition, but there's this interstitial moment where the two pictures come together in a significant way, sort of creating an entire film of a dissolve, kind of takes that idea even further.
It's consistent with what's going on.
And what's even more amazing, and I found this out after the film, but it's a great, it's a great thing about John is, and I believe this is an unrelated coincidence, but it seems to be, like a lot of these, too much to be a coincidence. He happens to be an incredibly accomplished palindromist. That John Paul Ryan can speak forwards and backwards as well, which is, there's kind of a chicken and an egg thing, but maybe that's why he's so interested in looking at things forwards and backwards, because that's the way he's already set up to think and to talk. And listening to Red Rum, it's like, that's interesting, he's speaking backwards. He thinks about speaking backwards more often than most of us do.
The skeptic in me made me think that it's, Kubrick always tends to compose with someone in the middle of the frame. So like when you run it, it's going to match up in that way. But what I find interesting about this approach generally is that it's making people aware of the form and the concept of framing and things like that. And a lot of people describe the film as being theories or conspiracy theories, and especially critics, I've read a few interviews where they're like, oh, I'm looking at films differently now after having seen this, and I'm thinking, all you're doing now is you're no longer paying attention to the story, you're starting to finally just pay attention to the form. And I wanted to talk about how this film kind of relates to just academia and like the history of formal analysis of film, and how that's seen as less of a pop culture or a mainstream approach, and this is kind of bridging those two spheres in some way.
I hear what you're saying, and I have a lot of sympathy for the people you're talking about, because, I remember reading, I can't remember where, but it was about an early Soviet cinema where someone was visiting from the country, had never seen a film, and the film was somewhat of a familiar art form to people who lived in the city, and they dropped this woman off at the cinema, and she came out and she was just in tears and she was terrified, and there was this head was cut off and his hand was cut off, and these were of course close-ups. But it takes a lot, we're so familiar with film and the language of film right now, it takes a lot to sort of shock you out, to make you look specifically at the form and not at the narrative, and not make those associations and connectivity that we're just so used to. So I don't know if we've succeeded in jump-starting a conversation like that. I'm very happy.
I'm not sure how much I have to add, but I don't come from a super hardcore academic background, although those are issues that, I'm very interested in. Though I also very much wanted this movie to be entertaining and watchable. And going with a subject matter like The Shining, which is such a popular popular movie, it makes it a little bit easier to get people into what's really an hour and 40 minute long exercise in semiotics, and having some jokes in the first half kind of makes it go down a little easier too. But I've had some great experiences after the film, talking with folks who are incredibly excited to discuss meaning and allegory and symbols, when it seems like that's not something that a lot of them do all the time.
Well, there's the relationship between the mastermind kind of acknowledging the forwards backwards and that causing a different approach from someone else. But how much overlap is there between the experts? Like, are these kind of hermeneutic, like just sitting down with the text, not paying attention to what other people are saying about the film, or is there a crossover in sharing ideas about?
Most of them had been working alone before we got to them, except for I think John Fell Ryan, of all of them, had probably been cross-pollinating and talking to more experts and reading more of this. I mean, he even talks about, I was looking at these sites and I was reading what the mastermind had to say. Certainly after the screening, Jeffrey Cox and Bill Blakemore, came to our premiere at Sundance, and since both their ideas kind of dovetail sort of nicely, and that they come from a more similar background, they hit it off really well and have started talking a lot and sharing ideas. And John Fell Ryan is actually the guy who, talking to him, he's the one who introduced me to Julie's work and her maps, because he had some maps that were interesting but not as elaborate as hers. And he said, if you want to see somebody who's doing really interesting work mapping the hotel, talk to Julie Kearns. So maybe we've got those two wings, those two schools of thought. And Jay Widener does collaborate with, he doesn't collaborate with the other people in our film, but he does collaborate, with a ton of other people, in other forums.
There are some experts that didn't get into our film, like Rob Age or Wrong Way Wizard. There's a bunch of these people, but and there is a bit more of a community of, like, there's discussion boards and flame wars and all the stuff that you expect that, but some lively conversations too. But our film didn't end up becoming about the community; it's about the ideas. And I think Rodney outlined pretty well where they were.
I'm wondering, how did you kind of then organize the structure of the film? I assume, like, when you're talking to each one separately, they're not necessarily aware of what other people have said and how they will fit into the film. And I mean, it announces its structure at the start, so that's also interesting to me. Yeah,
well, a lot of it was originally going through the interviews, I'd edited them into these self-contained segments, 3 minutes, 7 minutes, 5 minutes, and they weren't braided together for a long time. And it was only, halfway, 2/3 of the way through the process where we started to, put them on Post-it notes and look for the interrelations. And although the structure can sometimes seem a little stream of consciousness, there's the biggest, broadest picture of what's happening is at the beginning we talk about their first encounters with the film and maybe what is going to be their angle of attack. What's their decoder ring, what's their strategy. And then, the long middle section is them laying out their big ideas and getting them more complicated. Maybe as we get, towards the, to the 75% mark, they start to interrelate more. And then, our final act is, how's the study of The Shining changed these people's lives? And for some of them, it's changed. It's these ideas in this work has had kind of a profound effect on their lives.
I like they use the word lives because with some of them, it's very clear that their whole approach is so imbued by what they were already interested in, to the point where, like, there's obviously the debate of how much of this is kind of projecting your own particular interests on. But it's also what happens with most people who study things is that something else that they're interested in crosses over.
Well, but it can be a chicken and an egg
Yeah.
kind of question too. It's like if I'm really interested in animal rights, I might see animal right themes in different works of art. And it might be that I'm projecting them, but of course a very real possibility is if the artist was interested in animal rights and had done something subtly in the piece of work, I am more primed to recognize it because I'm more operating on a similar wavelength.
Yeah. Yeah, it often comes down to the argument that Kubrick had clearly had an interest in this because of this piece of personal biography, I guess. Like he had read this same book, especially with the subliminal. And that's interesting as well because the subliminal, I don't know, maybe this is my reading of it, but the picture of Kubrick in the clouds seems like the type of thing that I can't see it. And I've talked to numerous people that cannot see this, and we've tried to see it, and you don't make any effort to necessarily point out where it's supposed to be. Was there ever a point where in getting the clips to kind of correspond with what they're talking about that you just had a difficulty seeing what they saw?
For the most part, no. And for the most part, I was especially excited when I would find them because these were all audio interviews.
Yeah.
I was talking to folks on the phone. I mailed them digital audio recorders, and I would scroll through the movie as they talked. But sometimes the conversation would go so quick that I'd miss a couple of points and not really get what they were saying until I went back and put the film together, and then I'd have like this eureka moment. And certainly when John Paul Ryan was talking about the forwards backwards thing, I couldn't see any of it. And I know there's that shot he talks about where Jack looks like kind of like a clown. I'm like, yeah, I guess that sounds kind of creepy. And we talked about it a little bit and we moved on. But then when I laid them on top of each other, I was like, Jesus Christ, that thing is horrible. That's the most disturbing, frightening thing I've ever seen in my life.
But sometimes Rodney was scrolling through the film while he was doing the interviews.
Yeah.
And I remember listening to the interview with Jay Widener as I was taking notes and so forth. And there's a part where Jay's talking about discovering this phallus in the sea.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm sitting there listening like, I can't even imagine this is real. And then I hear Rodney go, oh my God, there it is. So, yeah.
And the clown thing is something that I think I can see it. I'm not 100% sure. I think having one that's a challenge is especially interesting, and the fact that it's a figure in the clouds, which a skeptic can say that some of this work in general is like seeing images in the clouds. That's all projective, I guess. That it's interesting that that's like the most difficult one because the idea of seeing things in the clouds is emblematic of kind of a projective reading. I think I see it. Only the one I see lasts more than just a frame. So I'm not sure if it's what. So I'm not 100% that that's the one that he's talking about.
What I find interesting about all of the readings is that they all kind of, to some extent, allude to something outside of The Shining, be it a conversation about the Native Americans or the Holocaust or Apollo 11. And I'm wondering, with some of these, and the example that stands out in my mind is when there's the aerial shot of the boy playing on the carpet and then it being closed. I get that. I see that probably was intentional. But to me, my mind is going more to like character study. Like, how do these formal devices just relate to the story and just relate to the characters in the text? Whereas many of these theories or readings allude to things outside or
strip it from the narrative.
Yeah.
Right.
I agree.
Well, I'm just curious, like why maybe you think that that's a through line through all of these readings is that they use the text to talk about things maybe outside of it, as opposed to just how these devices relate to the story.
Maybe this goes back to the thing I was saying earlier about the film some of these people believe that the film is intentionally an unsatisfying experience, and that, well, I'll agree with you that formally a lot of that stuff is very important, that maybe the idea is that you're supposed to view it stripped from the narrative and stripped from the obvious intention of the formal aspects. But that's just a guess.
Yeah, certainly both Bill and Julie, I think, talk about Kubrick films in general and The Shining in particular as, ending with a puzzle. Basically confronting and insisting that the audience go back and look for clues of some sort. Certainly the picture at the end is begging a question of what does this mean, and not symbolically, what does it mean just as far as the story is concerned.
Right.
But I love that The Shining has inspired people to look at it at these other layers, both about Kubrick's biography and about different political messages or allegories. Because when I read people talking about something like Prometheus or the last couple of recent movies that have sort of caused people to speculate on things, a lot of what they write about, interesting as it is about just sort of the plot in the story and saying, well, you have to put this into on the level of the text,
right,
and not on these layers upon layers of metaphoric readings.
Right, like with the Christopher Nolan film.
Yeah, like people talk a lot about Inception.
Right.
They debate, is it a dream, is it not a dream?
Right.
That's
What
all about the
part's a
story.
dream, yeah.
Although I did see one where people were talking about it as sort of an investigation into the movie making process, and that the dreams are like cinema, but I haven't seen like 5 or 6 or 7 entirely alternate readings of the movie yet.
Right.
But The Shining just creates those, sort of seems to be generating them spontaneously.
But there is something about, with this sort of clue aspect to it, where it is often a single shot or something that's very much formal and part of the film that sparks this entire theory. We were just reading a new one where the position of Jack's hands in the photograph at the end suggests this sort of goat-like figure in tarot cards, and this inspires this sort of alchemaic understanding of the film. But again, that starts with one image and then goes outward.
And it seems like Kubrick is maybe the only director that this could apply to, because so much of this is based on his rigor as a human being. Because it's so easy to just, when even talking to filmmakers, how often it comes up like, oh, I just thought that looked interesting in that moment, or like the cinematographer just thought that looked interesting. And how much of this maybe is unique, and there are two experts that chronicle Kubrick beyond just The Shining, but how important is Kubrick as?
Well, I mean, certainly he has a reputation as the most meticulous, accomplished filmmaker, of his day. One who had, how many masterpieces behind him when he set out to make The Shining. But also more than, most any other filmmaker, his films are assumed to be the vision of a singular personality. That all movies, his included, are collaborations. Though his sometimes seem like less a collaboration than other people's.
And Kubrick is noticeably almost completely absent from your film, which I found really interesting. There's so many opportunities to use the images or video of him, and he's almost completely outside of the film.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a couple times when he gets in there, but again, it got kind of interesting for it to be this is not a exhaustive biography of Stanley Kubrick by any means, but more a look at the idea of Kubrick and what does Kubrick mean to people.
Right.
So it got interesting, frequently through it to use stand-ins for Kubrick or surrogates of him, or just to imagine his sort of presence behind. In Jaws, you don't see a whole lot of the shark.
Well, it also alludes to some extent to the relationship these people have to Kubrick, because Kubrick's so important to their readings, but in many ways, they never have that relationship with him. He is always gone. He doesn't know these people. They didn't know him when he was alive.
Right.
I think these are smart people, and they're passionate, and they're very involved, and I tend to think those are characteristics that Stanley shared. So I think there's definitely some connection with him that starts the whole thing rolling.
Well, it's amazing because I know, talking to Bill Blakemore, he told me that he saw Stanley Kubrick not as an incredibly important artist and filmmaker, but in a complicated way, also an incredibly accomplished journalist. Because Bill Blakemore is a journalist, and he sees a kinship between their two works. And my having taught editing for 2 years before really getting into the film made me consider what an interesting editor he was. And I think about that scene in 2001 before we go to the Bone spaceship transition, but just, sort of that when he's holding the bone and then we see those like boars falling.
Like a flash forward or something.
Yeah, well, and it's like, is it a flash forward? Is it an idea? Is he just being told what this thing can do?
Yeah.
Are we seeing what's going to happen because of it? And it's a kind of an unanswerable but fascinating puzzle. And there's something similar that happens in room 237 where we see Jack entering to the room through his eyes, but it might be Danny projecting that image into Halloran's head. And then we see the old woman coming towards Jack, but there's like a jump cut of her rising out of the tub that looks like it's photographed backwards, and it could possibly be a memory that Halloran has had. There's so many ways to approach that little sequence of shots, so I'm incredibly fascinated by what he's doing in his editing style, and think of him as an incredibly smart, forward-thinking editor. And I was talking about that idea to Jonathan Snipes, him and Bill Hudson were our music composers, and he said, "That's funny. I think of Stanley Kubrick as the most accomplished music supervisor because his choices of music in the soundtrack are so provocative and work so perfectly." So that was, so each of us are seeing Kubrick as sort of a much better version of ourselves.
In your interactions with the experts, and you're noticing these things from an editing standpoint, are you ever supplying questions to them, like to maybe provoke further research? Like you mentioned these series of point of view shots and what they might mean. Are you ever offering these points to see if...
I tried, but that was never very fruitful. Whenever I would try to insinuate my own ideas into it, they would never really go into terribly fruitful conversations.
Even in follow-up emails, Rodney threw out something that would seem to me really evocative, and they'd run a different direction. They'd be like, "That's very interesting. That made me think about something completely different."
Because I have a theory that the room 237 scene is actually edited out of sequence, in that Jack goes into that room before Wendy wakes him up. And I could write a little thing about that idea, and I was kind of hoping that I might suggest that idea to one of them and that they'd take it and if I'd be able to present it. But they just weren't biting. And even when, like, I would have notes of what people had written, and so the harder I would try to solicit them to say specific things that they had said before, the worse it would go. So it was always just kind of letting them follow their paths, and they would often come up with things they hadn't. They would, spontaneously say things that they hadn't written about that were, even more interesting. And certainly, for some reason, the way Jay gets into, his inspiration about the Apollo 11 mission, he tells it in a way that is so compelling because he's not just saying, "Here's how it works. These symbols mean this." He says, I got the Blu-ray in the mail, and I turned it on, and I was watching, and I had this revelation." And he brings us to that moment of discovery, which is just such a rewarding story when listening to it. So a lot of these interviews would just.
I think with Jay, you asked like 3 questions.
Yeah, and then he would just go. When I would try to be too calculating about getting them to come forward with specific points, it was never very good.
Yeah, it's like an hour plus conversation. I think Rodney asked 3 questions, and one was probably, "How are you doing today?" or something.
Or how did you come to start studying the work of Stanley Kubrick?
Right.
And I think I've read from more experienced, accomplished documentarians than myself that the best questions are the simplest ones. Why? Really? In that trying to ask a clever question is not always the best strategy.
Has it reached a point where maybe the relationship with this project has provoked the experts to pursue a video of their own to just present their argument? Because I think I read that there's one, maybe it was the mastermind, that is preparing a DVD or something that's going to present.
Well, Jay Weidner has already released 2.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And the third one sounds pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Because he's kind of outsourcing it. He's got, I guess, a bunch of people have come to him and said, we're finding this in the film, we're finding this. And he says, I've got this army out there watching these films closer than anyone's ever watched and discovering things that have never been seen. So that's pretty cool. And then there's Rob Ascher.
Yeah, because we had approached him, but the timing didn't work out. He's written these amazing things, about Kubrick films on his site, and he's making his own DVD. He's made a bunch of YouTube clips, and there's if you go on YouTube and look for Shining Analysis, you'll see 100 alternate versions of Room 237.
Oh, really?
Made by different folks who've seen different things.
And then there's even someone will make a video. Rob Ascher has made this video about he feels that there's a severed head visible in the blood.
Oh, Tony, yeah.
It's Tony, right. And then there's another guy who's made a rebuttal video using really advanced CGI to see here's how the light would come and here's the source that would create the look of that.
And that's a perfect example of maybe my relationship to the whole project, which is that I find it interesting just the observation that at a certain point in the film, Tony is no longer present. I don't need a potential severed head to be a eureka moment for that. It's just the structure of the story is interesting. Tony is gone at this point. That there is.
Well, if that head is there, it's subtle.
That's interesting.
Was there a point when you were kind of going through the wormhole of this that you felt like maybe you were in some Jorge Luis Borges story where now you're making a film about people who are analyzing this and they've got armies of people that are also approaching this?
No, absolutely. And there's also a very strong relationship between the process and where Jack was in his life. That if you would look at the making of this film, a lot of it is me sitting at a keyboard for hours and hours and hours, not far from a big staircase, working on something that could potentially just be gibberish, resenting intrusions from my wife and small son.
Yeah.
Me and Tim have talked a lot about it because we both have very small children, and if we originally watched The Shining through the point of view of Danny, we're certainly at the stage in our lives where Jack is the character to identify with and to see as a very cautionary figure.
And I've always felt if in Rodney's scenario, he's Jack typing away, I'll work and he'll play, that I'm the Overlook enabling him to think that his work is brilliant, And it really felt that way for a long time.
Or Grady, even.
Even Grady, you've always been the caretaker.
The poster I find really interesting because it's almost I saw the poster actually after watching the film, and I found that moment the most persuasive, which is that shot and the pattern, and especially the map. I'm wondering how is that maybe a support of that as a striking argument within these sea of arguments, or how did you come to choose that as?
Well, I'm deciding whether or not to answer this question so as to not to leave. Yeah. to leave the window open to looking at it differently.
How about this? that they both spring from the same life spring of Kubrick and of attraction to that shot.
Well, and I think within The Shining and in Room 237, the moment when Danny is being drawn to the door is a key moment.
Yeah.
In the way John Paul Ryan says, that's the activation. And the moment when Danny walks to the door which is ultimately going to activate the story and bring Grady over and set off his mom to accuse Jack and make all the to set off all the chain reactions of the second half of the film is incredibly like the moment in 2001 where Haywood Floyd and the other men on the moon touch the monolith and activate the message from beyond Jupiter that's going to send the mission out. That that's where that's where the meat of the drama really goes. And in 237, that moment where we look at that carpet more carefully is one that for people who may have been skeptical about some of the other possible continuity errors, possible moments, possible signs, cannot deny that there was something weird happening here. And for anyone who's worked on a movie set would know that to get that wrong is harder than to get it right, because you would have to physically take all of those cars and move them from one side of the thing to another, and tell Danny Lloyd to rotate himself 180 degrees.
And I guess if you used the carpet from the actual room, it would be too sexually provocative for a poster.
Yeah, I guess so.
Well, thank you guys.
Well, thank you.